thank everyone for joining us here today. My name is Jack Lew. I'm the Deputy Secretary of State with special responsibility for management and resources. The previous incarnation was the Director of the Office of Management and Budget and worked on these kind of IT and management issues government-wide. And in between, spent a few years in the private sector, in the university world, and the financial services industry, where I also had responsibility for technology planning and decisions. So for me, it's a special honor to sit with a distinguished group like this in order to tackle what is really a very, very significant question. How do we get better value in how we plan and purchase IT systems and manage them for the federal government? How do we have a return on our investments that warrants the very substantial investments that we make? We all come to this with perspectives that are general and particular, but in the past year, we're looking through the lens of an agency. I guess I see a slightly different picture than I saw when I looked at the whole government, and it's interesting to look at the contrast. From an agency perspective, you're focusing on getting your work done. You have current missions and you have things that you want to do. And you look at a world which doesn't lend itself easily to strategic planning, particularly in an area like IT, where decisions are made based on what you know today, and in the system that we have, they're probably not implemented for the better part of 2 years until after you make them, because the funding doesn't come along right away. And I guess I would put a couple of questions out there just on my own, just by way of introduction, that one of the things we need to learn from you on and hear from your experience on is how do we look at the work we're doing to have a mechanism to detect problems early, so that if we need to change course, we can do it before we've gotten so deep into a project that it becomes both too costly and too difficult to change. I mean, at the risk of oversimplifying it, how do we get to the place where our strategy drives our systems, as opposed to our systems are determining our strategy? And the two are related, because if our strategies are evolving and our systems are locked, it's very hard to not get in a place where at some point you do the best you can with the system that you decided on, whether or not it reflects your current strategy. It's a real pleasure to be here with a colleague from OMB that I think needs no introduction to anyone here, Vivek Kundra, who comes to government with to the federal government with a proud record of accomplishment in state government as one of the leading thinkers about IT questions. And it's really it's an honor to chair the panel with him and to have him working across the government in this area. And we also are joined by two other deputy secretaries. Are we both here? And Neil Wolin is Deputy Secretary of the Department of Treasury. And
I'm Elaine Duke. I'm the Undersecretary for Management,
okay.
Here for Jane.
That's good. So I knew that I was not seeing my other colleague. Thank you very much. So without taking further time, I'd like to ask Vivek if you could introduce the topic that we're here to discuss a little bit, and then really get to the purpose of today's session, which is for us to listen to you so that we can learn from your experience, and then regroup with our colleagues to share what we've learned.
Great. Thanks, Jack, and thank you to all of you for doing a wonderful job actually on the homework assignment that we sent. It was extremely insightful in terms of the feedback that we got, and detailed feedback as far as what the United States government could do to address some of the toughest problems that it faces when it comes to managing over $76 billion in information technology projects. What was really interesting in terms of consistent themes was, as a function of the grading exercise, what we noticed was that a lot of people converged on strategic plans driving IT investments. That actually ended up ranking as the #1 thing. It scored about 26 points. And right below that, at about 25 points, was oversight that gives us early warnings. And we saw that consistently, whether it was Weyerhaeuser or United or Air Products, across the board, we're getting feedback around that. What was really interesting to the IT community was that shared services and lightweight technologies ranked at 0. No one really talked about technology itself, but it was very much focused around strategy, driving information technology, and more importantly, having a robust governance infrastructure. And below that, what we thought would have ranked higher was our measuring and tracking return on investment, and then of course, business risk itself. That ranked fairly low. But what was really interesting as we went through the homework assignment itself was just a lot of the feedback we got and bringing to life some of the examples, and we'd love to engage in a discussion where we can bring theory to life through how you're actually doing it and what could the government do, learning from how you've managed really complex IT projects where you've delivered some of these initiatives on time, on budget, but more importantly, producing the dividends that were promised up front, which seems to be one of the challenges within the government itself.
I just had one question. Is this an on-the-record session today, right now? I know in the big group it was, just to make sure that we know how our comments will or might be taken.
Yes, it's actually on the record and it's being broadcast live.
Great.
Real networks.
Maybe use smart technology. I'd be happy if that were the case.
And if I could just add one more housekeeping item before we open it up for full discussion. We've asked Dan Fulton from Weyerhaeuser and he's graciously agreed to be the reporter back to the group for our session here. So when we wrap up with this conversation, we will just reserve a few minutes to sit down and prepare that so that we can go back and make sure we've reflected everything well.
Sure. So maybe we can start with Glenn, with you to talk a little bit about what you're doing in terms of United Airways as far as really focusing on the strategy and how that's really driving a lot of your investments across the board.
So I'd offer two thoughts about issues that we confront now that are different than those that we would have confronted previously. Number one, the industry is changing worldwide by the convergence of networks. So partnership is driving a good bit of how the consolidation in this industry is going to evolve over time. So if you think of developing a strategic plan for a United Airlines, Lufthansa, Air Canada, and Continental as opposed to simply United, the challenge that you've highlighted here is exponentially more complex because of the legacy systems that exist in all of those companies. But the response to it is actually the same. Putting the outcome in the strategic plan of the association of, say, an immunized joint venture across the Atlantic Ocean with those four companies together with a board of governance that understands that it's the ambition of the joint venture that actually provides both of those first two. A clear delineation of where the destination is for the business opportunity, and secondly, the oversight giving early warning so that in the event that the technology obsolesces, then there are exit ramps to the plan, no different from any other business plan or any of the significant capital investment where we can actually move off of it. But the most important thing about it is the ability to work across governance structures that are different from your own and render them subordinate to the overarching ambition of the project or the business proposition. If that's a little too abstract, which I don't think it is, but our working with the Department of Transportation and the FAA on air traffic control modernization, which remains an enormous frustration for not only us, but for all of the traveling colleagues that we have around the table and all of your executives and managers, getting to the point where, frankly, change in governance, I mean, you have a unique dilemma, I think, in public service in the government, and that's things called elections. And obviously you have to find a way to deal through change in authority and administration, which I think is less pervasive in the private sector. But it's really analogous to our other partnership. For all of us in the air transport business, establishing what the IT solution is to the modernization of something such as the air traffic control system requires really a continuity of purpose and an ambition that transcends governance change, because your governance change is more emphatic than probably ours. So I would just echo those major points that we brought together, and I thank you for the opportunity to do the homework assignment, because frankly, it allowed us sincerely to refresh our thinking on some very appropriate questions.
If I could pick up and ask a question based on the governance system point.
Right.
I think in an ironic way, our governance structure is more clear and more emphatic, but also more rigid. To the extent that businesses have a bottom line, elected officials have accountability on election day, and a change means you have a whole change of objective in many cases. That's a very emphatic kind of change. But there's the other side of government, which is that we're about to release a budget in February, which will take effect in October, and the planning process began a year or more ago. From my brief period in business, the decisions on IT were more quarterly decisions than they were 2-year ahead decisions. There was a running list of objectives, and then there were resource decisions that we put against what were business needs as they were evolving. And we're in a world where if you change a year into your planning process, it might take you another 2 years to get funding for it.
I say, Jack, two things. Number one, I think it probably depends on the magnitude of the capital investment that the project requires, and the extent to which change is an inherent risk in the success of the project that you've agreed, so that it is a long-term commitment rather than a short-term commitment, and the process of change would be very destructive to the presumption of whatever the return is that you've calculated for the project. The one that I used is the one that, if you can imagine how difficult it would be to change a project that involves 4 different companies with 4 different governance processes, that's really why I chose that example. The other thing that I say is governance really goes to authority and prerogative for having the authority to be able to make a change, even if the change is necessary or not. And I think one of the challenges that you have is every CEO sitting around the table has authority over the various internal bureaucracies that we govern. I think that the challenge of separate departments within different agencies is more profound for you to govern in your respective new responsibilities than it is within Weyerhaeuser or within Air Products or United.
I think there's even a more profound difference for us in the government, which is that, when you want to commit resources, you go to your board of directors, you commit resources.
Right.
Apart from the lag effect that Jack talks about, we got to go to Congress. And so, in many cases, the sort of authority control set of questions is massively more complicated by just the basic structure of our government and the extent to which, at a macro level for sure, but increased, often at quite a granular level, these are funding decisions that are ours to propose but not ours to make.
I think, Neil, I'm going to yield here, but I think to the extent that you have countervailing issues that you have to work through, and through the process of your governance or your approval or your authority to actually invest the sums, such as, say, perhaps a political consideration that pushes against the modernization for reasons that could be territorial, or that could be bureaucratic, or it simply could be differences of legitimate opinion, or it could be that the modernization actually is going to reduce jobs.
Let me ask John to jump in from Electronic Arts to talk about how do you get executive sponsorship, right? Because that's one of the core issues, and you're running a very high-tech company where you're looking for talent globally. When you're driving IT investment, how are you making sure, because that's something we share in the public sector too, is making sure that there is alignment between business and in technology.
Really good.
So, pretty broad question, but I'll try to tackle it. With any sort of multinational technology company, and I did list executive sponsorship as the number one issue. And what I was getting at was having clarity of purpose, clarity of design, clarity of what we're trying to get out of a significant IT investment. And then making sure that once we've designed or defined the project goals, while they can change in response to differing circumstances or new information in the marketplace, they largely remain intact through the process of implementation. And a second factor that I would raise is that earlier in my career, when I was working on ERP implementations for prior companies, like enterprise software company implementations in terms of just keeping track of the books, it was invariable where the French would want it one way and the Germans would want it a little bit different, the Italians would want it one way, the Americans would want it one way, all with their own custom touch and interface and tools and tech and implementation connection to things that they'd done previously. And if I were to identify the two major pitfalls to successful IT implementation as I see it, one is lack of clarity up front, and the other is feature bloat. And so when you're trying to put things in place to solve for three important problems, you can often do that well. When you then add the three things from 17 countries and 3 more departments, et cetera, and the project objective list starts to be 60, 70 goals, 80 goals, 100 goals incorporated. And on top of that, individuals that might be engaged in a steering committee having a different view of what those goals might actually mean. You can take something that can be relatively simple to deliver and achieve its major goals in a 3-month, 6-month, 9-month, 12-month period and multiply that by 5x, sometimes 10x, and drive yourself into project failure. So what I try to do now to answer your question is to make sure that we're absolutely clear about what we're trying to achieve and that we trim away as many of the ornaments as we possibly can to get to vanilla implementation. A lot of the enterprise software companies or the IT companies that I see, they actually make pretty good products that can sometimes be taken, quote unquote, out of the can and onto your server and actually work. And what, I don't know that I've ever been involved in an IT project that didn't cost more for customization than the core license of the software. And frankly, it's nuts. So my advice, clear project leadership, extremely narrowly defined purpose, to the degree possible, of course, leave the back door for future flexible, additions or connections, but it needs to be run with a strong hand, both at the project management level and the executive sponsorship level, to make sure that happens. And when you're subjected to what I suspect you are, and we had a chance earlier to talk a little bit about this, of competing agendas from different agencies or different constituencies in one large bureaucracy, and they all have their say, I don't know how you can make it work in an efficient way. Keep it narrow, keep it tight, and make it happen.
And could you maybe say a few more words about that back door? Because to the extent that you have a system where the 4 corners define what you're doing, it does force the resolution of kind of the differences of stakeholders at the front end. To the extent that you design an effective back door where you can come back and revisit it and do things incrementally, it potentially changes the shape of the process. Are there best practices on that?
Well, again, I think this is where, flexibility in design comes into account. So, 15 years ago, I was involved with a significant ERP implementation where we had to define our chart of accounts, put codes in place for those particular charts of accounts so that each classification of expense had a place to live in an ERP database. We're currently now putting with an electronic arts, we've captured in the last year 50 million unique users with a database of our customers and all their permissions to use our various products, what they're allowed to use, what we've, they're allowed to play Madden, but they're not allowed to play NBA Live because they paid me for Madden, but not for NBA Live, that type of thing. And invariably, you can have a database that might have, frankly, the flexibility to have unlimited number of fields that you can later define for what data you might want to capture or what DRM system you might want to implement or what permission system you might want to allow for. And what I'm talking about with flexibility is a lot of times people will try to hard code their version, their view, their window. And what that causes is literally massive customization. If you work with any sort of reasonable current day technology, the idea that the system's flexible to add, future requirements for screening it one way or another and not having to define it up front, that exists. That exists in virtually any technology we're implementing, or it can be built into any technology. Where it gets to be problematic is a lot of times, if you have a group of people collectively designing the outcomes or collectively designing what they believe to be their objectives, they get in this mode of dreaming of the 15 different ways they might want to use it. They start to think that I might want to use it when I'm at home, and I might want to use it when I'm on my BlackBerry, and I might want to use it when I'm on my iPhone. That's all fine, and that's actually pretty easily accomplished with the various technologies that exist today. But they also start to imagine that they want to have it in hard-coded reports that look 15 different ways. And they ask for it because they can dream of it. They can imagine it, and not because it's essential. And so I guess my advice to you would be cut all that is not absolutely essential to the mission, and then when it comes to the fields that you might ultimately populate, no-fly lists and connecting them to visas, that's a feature that you hadn't previously done, that's a relatively easy, it just might be an issue. If that's the data set you want to later collect, if you've got an open architecture to the actual underlying database, and I think virtually all of them do, you can accommodate that later. But keep it narrow and tell people to stop dreaming and focus on what the principal objectives are.
So John and Shantanu, you're both in the technology business, and you work on a lot of these projects. You sell to customers, and they implement really large-scale IT projects. In your experience, where do you see success versus failure?
I actually agree. I mean, we first of all, people who try to change too many things up front. One of the things that I see the government project always we get involved with, too many people writing the specs. I think that's the one thing that in private enterprise we don't have that luxury, because as my guys start debating what the specs looks like for the next systems, I'll be out of business before. So what we normally do is, so when you say IT is strategic fit, for example, I'll give you a real life example of what we're doing. So we are, like a lot of tech companies, we bought a lot of companies. So each company has a different order entry system, so I'll just make one statement. And so because of efficiency and return on investment, we made it work. So everything is like a bolting, things are connected kind of loosely, whatever. And then every so often we decide to do a cleaning of the whole system and make a very elegant system. And oftentimes what we find out at work is we get the team together, we define what the needs ought to be, and then we stop the spec right there. And then we empower one group, whether it's the IT group or whoever, go do it. And then everybody use off the shelf. Now this is a very important thing, because if you don't use off the shelf, then it goes to the 15 different way of hardwiring reports comes out. And the answer is no, 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 and no, and because we just can't. Oftentimes what you do is you get something accomplished, everybody then adopt it and adapt to it. If you let people just have a say up front, I mean, I know it's too autocratic or whatever the right word is, but it works best for us, and we save a lot of money, we get it done, and after a while the culture is that if you don't give your input in the very beginning, which is very limited in time, then you just have to, do your best with it, whatever it is. And there will be a next cycle. So, and that's how we advise our customer too. And it works pretty well. And now, if we started deviating from the spec too much, because there are no such off-the-shelf technology, we tend to cancel the project. So we're not shy on saying that maybe what, like, we're going to implement certain SAP function, for example. We're going to just use the standard SAP function, and everybody just go around, you change their business rule around it. Otherwise, it'd be a sinkhole of money and time.
So Vivek, we have, I think, an interesting challenge in that we both deliver, as you know, a lot of software, and we use a lot of software. When you're delivering software that people download to the tune of 9 million a day, it just means that that software then that people is out there in the public domain. So the ability to change that software is very hard. So we're very cautious about it. But two thoughts come to mind. The first is we're firm believers in, rather than starting at it from what are you trying to accomplish at the back end, put the individual or the user at the center of everything that you do. We're big believers in design matters. And if people are going to use that technology, it's going to be successful and it's going to be effective. And I think to the points that were made earlier, the more complexity you have in all the features that you are trying to put in, the less it's going to get used, which means the less it's going to be effective for the constituencies that you're trying to address. So we solicit feedback a lot. One of the things we're finding as tech is emerging is, the viral nature of how people use software. It tells you something, and I think traditionally enterprises have tried to mandate software without necessarily listening to what people are using, and I think there's a lesson in that for all of us, because what's being used frequently, if you look at all of the pieces of software that have had explosive growth, it's because people like using it, and it's intuitive, it's easy to use, so design matters. Second thing, I think reiterate something that folks have said, which is complexity. I'm a firm believer anything that takes more than 18 months is probably too complex and is probably going to be obsolete by the time you implement it. So keep it simple, have the right architectural attributes to it, but build as you go rather than try and have a grand unification of all the architectures, because I don't think that exists.
I just wanted to chime in because we have a side of our business that's very much like John and Shanti's business, and then we have a side of our business that's more like John's business. We have a consumer-facing technology side. Now, there are three things they've said that I think I hugely agree with, and one I'd add. The first is what John said, using off-the-shelf components to the greatest extent possible in this new open source world. The range of tools that are off-the-shelf are available and the richness of what they make possible. And every time I deal with an old-style IT organization, I find that there's just a level of institutional resistance to that because it's a totally different methodology. So both off-the-shelf and recognizing that in this open source world, the shelf has gotten so much bigger and the stuff on the shelf gets better and better every day. So I think having an openness to those kinds of methodologies and really not mandating them, of course, because that's just be silly to do, but educating the IT organizations on that range of options and that range of choices is hugely important. Second, something Shantanu said about the feedback loop, and I know John mentioned it as well. One of the things we've learned in both our internal systems and our customer-facing work is that the world we're in involves so much feedback, and if you build that feedback loop into the system while you're deploying it, obviously you want to take feedback that's consistent with the strategic plan. Your product or service will get so much better, and you'll build a different kind of relationship with the customer. Instead of being a one-way relationship, I'm giving you information, I'm delivering you a service. It's a two-way relationship where the recipient of the service actually can provide feedback directly in along the development of that, going from version 1 to version 2, et cetera. That's one of the most powerful things we've seen in all of the systems we've deployed. And the third, this goes back to John's point earlier, and has been made by a few people. Knowing who the customer is and being super crisp about that is incredibly important. Typically, executive sponsorship is a great way of doing that. We deploy systems for end customers, and we build systems for ourselves. I'm very pleased to say that our success rate with the systems we're deploying for end customers, carrier customers like Verizon or T-Mobile or AT&T or the like around the world, is very high. Over 98, 99% success rate of deployment because it's business and commercial critical. I would say, and it's a little bit harder to quantify because of the fact that you can have a system that is deployed, but there's a little bit of a stumble, that on our internal systems, our success rate by the same quality metrics is probably more like 85%. And I ascribe that delta to the fact that you have an incredibly high level of measurability on who the customer is when you have a formal change order process, and the customer either has to agree to the change order process or say, no, I won't take the change order, I'd rather not add that to the system. So I think there's a level of benefit associated with the formality of the economic measurement that you intrinsically have in that commercial situation. I can only imagine the systems that Glenn described, where you have this hybrid of your system, your partner airlines, the FAA, where it's a hybrid, it must get really complicated, so I know it's not always that black and white, but the more you can build that measurability which is kind of a combination of the first two measures that our group collectively scored so high. I guess the whole group scored so high, the better that you do. So that'd be sort of my synthesis from being on both the building systems for our own internal use and building systems for carrier customers and other partners.
But, you know, for a lot of the things that we do in government, it kind of starts out closer to Glenn's model. I mean, if we talk about sharing data across government agencies, it's probably more different than different airlines because there were systems that were built to achieve different purposes, not systems that were built to get to the same end. And I think we've seen on many occasions, and that's a big challenge for us in government, to ask the question, if you were starting from scratch, how would you do it, is very different from asking the question looking ahead, knowing that strategically it's so important for us to be able to collaborate across agencies. How do we think about an IT strategy that builds bridges
I think the point that just one comment on Rob's point is it's a function really of what John was saying, in my opinion, across business units or across certainly corporate entities or departments. And it has a lot to do with, I think, how you establish the premium for success. I mean, what you heard everybody say is you've got to find a way to get the tendency to make more complex or the tendency to perceive discretion when that discretion is capricious rather than contributive to whatever the goal may be, whether you're a for-profit or you're not. And I agree with you. I think yours is actually even greater than transatlantic. You know, talking to the Germans, which I can assure you has its challenges. But at the end of the day, right. If you agree the size of the prize and you agree what that prize looks like, and you have, and I guess I left this out. Rob sort of mentioned it. If you have executive sponsorship that defines prerogative and discretion, and the tendency to do exactly what the other gentleman discussed, I think you have the discipline that.
Also, Jack, and there's always a balance somewhere. We all wanted every agency to share information. Let's just for now forget about either the sensitivity information or the need to know. So just forget about the business rule for a second. You're building the bridge. You know, when I build a bridge, it's always one point to one point. I know this seems to be, connecting two silos only, and then you have 60 silos, and you want to connect it all. But you got to think about whether that's even possible. I actually normally think that we ought to build some maybe 2 or 3 different organizations that share the information first, and then ask everybody build on top of that. Otherwise, we start having a spec that has 60 different inputs. You don't have enough time just to have that discussion. Forget about, by the time you're done with that discussion, people changes and stuff like that, you start all over again. And God forbid you already procure some software or whatever. I mean, at that time you say, well, we don't need this because it's useless. And I think if I look at, I know whether the sensors or whatever, I mean, there's a lot of projects, it all were extremely well intended in the beginning of time. And it was great. It was modernization and stuff, and then all the requirements start creeping in. At times it lapses, and then everybody say, "Oh well, if we do it this way, now there's a newer technology. We could use Google Desktop, whatever it is." I'm making it up as I go. Right? So then eventually you get to the point that this resulting project has very little resemblance of how we started, and in business. Accountability creeping, a bunch of people get fired, blah 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 blah, and it won't last to that long. But in government agency, just because you need to make sure that everybody's a stakeholder, I think that may be a fallacy by itself.
So can I
I mean, I don't mean to pretend to know your business. I'm just suggesting that there's kind of a n-dimensional cube that doesn't have an answer.
I would love to shift the discussion in terms of what this has been very insightful in terms of how you launch IT projects. What do you do once they're in flight? You've got a whole portfolio, and John, you had some interesting responses in terms of what you were doing at Air Products and Chemicals, and also Dan at Weyerhaeuser. Once you have a portfolio of investments, how do you manage them? How do you make the decisions where to continue investing, where to divest, where to course correct?
Well, yeah, I'll answer that in 1 second. The one comment that I'd make, and maybe even before that, is I think we looked at this as an investment in our business first, and that was a real fundamental shift in our thinking about IT. Historically, IT was something that delivered a solution to the business. There wasn't a lot of ownership. In other words, here's what I want, go away. It either didn't work, largely not because the IT didn't work, but because the definition, the scope of what was trying to be achieved was never tied down at the beginning. And then there wasn't sufficient ownership at the business level to deliver and drive that. You got to put in my mind, a very rigorous governance structure. And, a big part of our business is building plants that we own and operate all over the world, thousands of them. We invest a lot of capital in that. And so we have a very project-oriented mentality. And we took that and applied this to really transforming. And I admit completely, Jack, and Vivek, it's a lot easier in an enterprise like ours than it is in a government. But in many, many ways, we were in 40 countries, multiple systems, multiple silos, thousands of facilities around the globe. Everybody knew they had the best way to do it. And we basically went and set some principles around one company, said we're going to use one system. We're going to use 80+% of the functionality of that system. And then we didn't take any prisoners, to be blunt. And we reviewed it as an executive leadership team. Every week we had a standing meeting of our corporate executive committee. Where are we? It's as simple as red light, green light. Where do we have problems? Who's not on board? Particular department or a particular country or a particular business wasn't on board, somebody in that room had responsibility for it. And we had basically said, we're not going to tolerate that. And we went out and heard what, in some cases there were valid reasons why it wouldn't work, and we dealt with those. But those were way, way, way a very small part of the total pie. We didn't really give too many exceptions. Drove the project, and we've got a single instance ERP globally on 95+% of our revenue.
Can you talk a little bit about, to bring that to life in terms of how do you have a special set of tools or processes in terms of how you look at these investments across the company?
In reality, every investment, whether it be an IT investment, whether it be a new plant, has to have a benefits case. And you got to drill those benefits hard enough to understand, are they real? And then once you define that, who's accountable for delivering them? And then review it sort of on the number 2 point up there on a frequent enough basis to make sure you're really getting what you started out to get. I mean, we, quite frankly, I won't use names, but we got about a year into the project and through these reviews, it wasn't getting anywhere near where we wanted to go. We changed the leadership. We changed some of the outside help that we had supporting the project, and so we had the conviction to say, hold it, stop. This one's off track. We're not going to end up with what we want, and it's not going to support the performance of our business. And so we did stop it in the middle.
Maybe we could talk for just a minute about the threshold for making a decision that says stop and making a decision to change, the team.
Right.
There are significant costs to each decisions like that.
Sure.
Presumably, it wasn't just a little bit of an incremental challenge. Was it? Did you feel that it had to be mission critical, that you couldn't get your goal accomplished, or that it was going to be more costly, take longer? Just a little color about how you make the go no go decision.
Yeah, I think the fundamental thing was when we went back to the touchstones of what we were trying to achieve with this transformation and where we were going, which was some of the comments that others made, trying to accommodate each and every individual's idea. And I'm exaggerating here a little because I go back to, we were pretty harsh on that. But trying to, well, you don't understand. My business in this market, in this country, is very different than your business. And, and yeah, it is at the interface between the customer. But 90% of it back isn't, And we had 35 order entry systems around the globe. We have 3 today. And those 3 are a function of the 3 main business models that we operate. And guess what? It works in Korea, works in Japan, it works in Texas, works in the United Kingdom. And because of that, we can share best practices and rapidly deploy those capabilities to where we need it. But you have to go back to, the touchstones, go back to my earlier comment. We looked at it less as an IT project and much more as a business strategy. Got the leadership on board, put a governance structure in, looked at our processes and said, we don't need 34. We might not get away with 1, but we know we can do a lot less than 34. We got to 3. And when people wanted to make 3, 6, or 9, the reviews that we had, the standing steering committee meeting every Monday morning, I didn't particularly like it at 7:30 in the morning either, but that flushed out ideas, flushed out problems, and generally there was someone in the room that had the accountability then to go solve that. We had a smaller 3-person executive team that was, obviously spending more than the once a week or once every 2-week meetings that I'm talking about, that was all over this. And scope changes, no matter how big or how small, were just rigorously challenged. And then there's the old adage in any the 80-20 rule applies here. Get it out, get it running. Don't assume it's going to be perfect. If you go in trying to get the perfect output, you'll never get an output. Get the output, and then go back and identify where you can improve. We look at, I think to your very specific point, I don't think investments in tools that don't give you a 2-3 year payback are worth the investments in things like this. No different than in a plant. So we've looked at it in that context.
And how about you, Dan, at Weyerhaeuser? How are you approaching? You've got a huge portfolio.
I'm reflecting that I wish I would have had this meeting before we made some of the changes that we've implemented. I mean, a lot of our IT is basic business manufacturing process control, but we've been through a major change in implementing an enterprise system. And I'm struck by a couple of things. Number one is that I do think you need to simplify the business process before you automate it, and otherwise you drive yourself to complexity. Whether it's order entry systems. We had different businesses that had the same customers, but we had different databases, and quite frankly, we weren't able to share information and consolidate across even our businesses. And so we've made progress there, but the focus that we've driven on is trying to simplify the process first. Haven't always been successful in doing so. We have a gating process for IT investment that is no different than the gating process that we have for other capital investments. And so we spend time identifying the scope and then we manage it. I was also struck by a comment about 18 months. My IT director used 18 months as the time frame, saying you shouldn't be doing anything that takes longer than 18 months because then the world starts to change and that creates problems. The other significant learning for me and for our company, I think, is that the businesses have to own the solution, and otherwise they will never embrace it. Rather than it being an IT-driven technology solution, if the businesses own it, then we'll get to the finish line. But if they don't, then we're going to have problems. And there was a 60 Minutes story on this past weekend, and it was about a government project implementing surveillance along the Mexican border. And my takeaway from that one 10 or 15 minute story was that the solution provider never talked to the customer, which was the border agency. And so perhaps they were delivering a solution that wasn't usable or manageable. And I think many times we err on the side of a technology solution where we've been successful is when the business really embraces it. And I think routine review and business commitment all along the way is critical. And as we drove a major enterprise solution across our company, our portfolio changed radically. And it would have been better had we been more adept in identifying some of those changes coming along, because we probably would have adjusted the project. And so that gets to this time frame. Looking out over a 3 to 5 year implementation period is unrealistic.
It's a thing you talked about in your homework assignment about IT failures and how that may be indicative of not just how you manage them, but core problems of the organization itself. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, So our company is much smaller. We don't have a lot of money to do IT. So what I noticed is that the IT project failure rate internally is very high. Larger projects are more likely to fail than a smaller one. Larger group is more likely to fail than a smaller group. So it's just some of those issues. And then what we did was, instead of just say, okay, it's going to fail, let's do smaller project, we kind of look at the failure itself as an asset rather than problem, because the IT failure helps you to identify the problem of the organization itself. If you don't do the IT project, sometimes you actually don't really crystallize where the problem lies. The failure crystallizes where the issue there. Those are the intangible asset to me as a CEO, because we always measure the success. But looking at the failure helps you to identify some of the key problems in your organization. So what we decided to do is early failure is cheaper than later failure, right? So take the early failure as an opportunity, because that gives you the warning of your problem that's pretty acute and at the core level, and then try to solve those problems. And then being a smaller organization, we have to break the problem down. So we decided to break the problem down quarterly. Like, I was reading the progress with open government document, and I noticed that you have this 60 days, 90 days mandate on what people need to do. We kind of do similar things. So every quarter we solve one problem, and the entire corporation is focused on this one and committed. And then other than your daily job, you have to do your daily job. But every quarter we are committed to make one thing better. So at the end of the year, we actually make 4 things better. I find if at the beginning of the year I tell everyone to solve 4 problems, at the end of the year I get 4 problems not solved. But if I say solve 1 problem each quarter, and if we decided we can solve this problem this quarter, make it later. Solve the one you can solve, and everyone have to be committed to that. And that seemed to be a very pragmatic way to do it.
I was just going to ask, in terms of spectacular IT failures, how many of you have stories to share in terms of how you were able to navigate through them? You talked about...
Is this on the record or not?
Says that with a smile.
And I just wanted to make sure I was introducing Peter Orzak, who's the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, and also Jeff Zients, who's the Chief Performance Officer.
Well, we certainly have a whopper for a company our size, threatened the company. In 2005, maybe you will recall, there was a wave of consolidation in the communications industry. AT&T, Bell South, and Singular came together. Verizon, MCI, WorldCom came together. And we at the time at least thought we needed to bulk up. So we bought serially 7 companies, which tripled our revenues from about $1.6 billion to about $5 billion. And prior to that set of acquisitions, we were growing about 20% a year. And recurring revenue business, that's a good clip. I mean, we don't sell boxes. We're a service company, so we get to bill what we sold yesterday and the day before, plus the increment we sell today. Our whole operational processes fell apart. And just to give you one metric, which is very important to our customers, when they order communications capacity, they're generally building it into their capability to meet their customers' needs 8-9 months later. So if we promise them service in 45 days, that's critical, or they disappoint their customers. Our service interval doubled, or went from 45 to 70. These are averages that hide a lot of complexity. 80, 90 days, huge problems. And as you might imagine, when that threatens the company, I got personally involved. I suspect, like many who aren't in the IT business, IT was a staff function that I paid attention to, but nowhere near as much as I did afterwards. And for what it's worth, I think you brought the word up that I would suggest is at the center of a lot of problems that any institution has. Institutions are generally organized functionally. They get a sales function, some kind of production function, some kind of perhaps engineering function, a planning function, a finance function. There is no process generally that matters that's organized that way. They all cut across functions, which makes traditional corporate organizations totally inadequate to define by themselves the requirements. Which means you got to focus around process, which is a new thing in most organizations. If you ask most organizations, what are your processes, you wouldn't find them documented very often. There's a whole body of work in this area. It's fairly new over the last 10 years, but there's governance processes, there's support processes, and there are core processes that have a customer at the end. You don't know what your processes are if you haven't documented them in some form of common language. You don't know the data that support those processes, and if it's not clean, you're just automating something that is broken to start with. If you spend more of your time and money on process documentation, and there are lots of ways to go about it, if you have somebody assigned to own a process, which is key to all of this, where it cuts across normal organizational boundaries, and whether your data is in a bunch of silos or you have a modern Sybase database system, if it's clean and you got data integrity, I think the automation process, while it's not simple, is doable. If you don't have those steps to start with, it's simply not doable. And I'm an outsider in government, but I would argue you have that problem perhaps more than any institution. You've got isolated, segmented, siloed, poorly documented processes. You got data that whose integrity is questionable. And if I were putting money in, I'd put it in to fix that. And IT'd be the tail, not the dog.
Though documentation may be one of the exceptions to the rule where government may start out in some cases ahead. I mean, because of the regulatory processes that we have, the legal structures we work within, so many of our processes are heavily documented. One of the things that people often complain about is the processes are too inflexible. But if in fact that is the thing that's key to planning IT more effectively, it's something maybe we should see that as an advantage.
I'll toss out one more notion, then I'll defer. When you say documented, if it's not documented in some form of language that matches up to your ability to automate those processes, business process markup language, for instance, is a big deal right now. But whatever you choose, if it's not documented in some way that the State Department process matches up with the DHS process, and you've got some common way of describing things, you really don't have process documentation.
Yeah, so the way we would say that is you're not aligned.
Right.
So documentation and clarity are words that people go to, and we use all of those. But what we do is we put someone on a project who is only there to make sure people are aligned. And what we have found, because we operate in 80 countries, is they use the exact same word, but they mean different things. And then they go off and go do something, and it's documented, it's in there, and everybody says, yeah, I understand that. And then you go away and you find out, well, why did you do all of that? And you found out when you really asked what seemed like sophomoric questions, which only an outsider can ask, or kind of a transversal kind of knowledge person who is not associated with the project says, I don't think you're really talking about the same thing you're talking about. You find out they weren't. And when we get misaligned, we stop a project and start over again.
I think that's an incredibly astute observation. The two are related, because when you do an acquisition or when you're trying to merge together departments that ran as separate stovepipes, they will speak different languages without knowing they speak different languages.
With the same word.
And exactly. And sometimes it's actually, when you have somebody speaking French and somebody speaking German and somebody speaking English, you know they're speaking different languages. The more pernicious kind I find is the subtle one, where you're both speaking the same nominal language, but you're using the terminology in a different way, and you don't understand the mapping. So I would say that the characteristics of projects that we've had that have had one of the two characteristics that the two of you described. Either it was because we did a merger of different organizations that had non-homeotopic ways of doing approximately the same thing, and so creating the mapping between one and the other was very hard. Or you had people that literally thought they meant the same thing and they didn't mean the same thing. And of course those two problems are related and they compound each other. So if there would be a way that you could score going into a project, what is the sort of cultural complexity of this project? And as probably an exponential function of the cultural complexity, hash through that up front. Hash through the terminology issues, hash through the business process mapping issues. And then once you have that sorted out, which you could say is a form of strategic plan, but it's a strategic plan set of issues that are intrinsic to those kinds of complexities, the ones that Glenn started us out with. I think the cases where we've done that up front, it's a little laborious, it may seem a little bit bureaucratic, but we've had much smoother sailing downstream when we recognize the complexity of that up front. Frankly, sometimes because we didn't recognize it up front, we went back and did that, and then we had a smoother result.
You know, the interesting thing about Rob's point, and I was really listening to the points that were made just a second ago about, you know, enterprise-threatening failures or enterprise-threatening circumstances, and I should have said it in the front end, is if the challenge of integration is more discrete, as Rob says, because it's language or it's culture and it's transatlantic or transpacific, you don't have to work so hard to actually get at the issue of cultural integration because it exists already for you as a big threat to success. The same, I think, is true in mergers and acquisitions. And I was just thinking about your point, Robbie. Having been through a number of those, there's no argument on the front end that, you know, Chevron and Texaco have two very, very different systems. We're going to have to integrate them, and there's going to have to be a lot of discipline in the process. So that part of the discussion that you were talking about, you know, sort of the passive-aggressive behavior from function to function doesn't exist because that discussion's up front. And I think in the government, from department to department, you know, organization to organization, having that discussion discreetly up front ought to be of some real benefit.
It'd be interesting to know who has the responsibility to say these departments really aren't aligned and this project's going to fail.
Yeah.
Because if it's the executive sponsor sometimes has that issue as well, which is they think they're getting agreement because you have clarity, but what you're getting is agreement on something that may not get you to the design phase that goes really fast.
So I wonder if when we look at government, there's another difference that is worth focusing on a bit. If there are different divisions of a company that have been merged because of acquisition, once you're together, oftentimes it's the same business. Multiple airlines are being joined. Sometimes you're doing different things and it's different enterprises, but still there's a common drive towards your common overall business objective and the way you're accounting for your business.
I had one question for our industry partners on that merger issue. So when you do the mergers and systems consolidation or alignment is part of it, how does the money go with it? For instance, in DHS, we consolidated into department, but the money is still siloed, appropriated to the individual departments. So our CIO sitting behind you, Richard, has a real challenge. How important is that? And do you have any advice specifically in
Well,
this?
I think they come together for different reasons because they come together for clarity of accountability, clarity for synergy capture, and you've gone to the investing public and said we're doing this because we're going to create value that we couldn't otherwise create. It's a bit different than the efficiencies that someone perceived would be a benefit by putting two departments together here.
So do you think it's imperative to actually centralize the money, or are there ways to do it without centralizing the money, I guess is my...
I think it goes back to what somebody said about complexity. I mean, if you don't...
Well, money is governance.
Yeah, right.
If you don't have centralized governance, you're going to have fractured project definition. But I probably wasn't as clear as I should have been. The M&A environment simply pointed us at a problem that was there, simply amplified the problem. And you used the right word, alignment. across organizations that are organized vertically, and all processes go horizontally. And generally what happens is a requirement poorly described is tossed to IT. IT is asked then to come back and document business processes, and they're the worst organization to do that. They don't have ownership, but the hard part, this is hard stuff, but make no mistake. If it were easy, we wouldn't be sitting at this table. What makes it hard is you've got to figure out some way to get a chain of people across vertical organizations to get aligned. And that's not easy.
The question I was going to drive towards in terms of alignment is, if we talk about the Treasury Department and the State Department, we have core missions that are very different.
Right.
Our systems are built to help us achieve very, very different basic goals. There are a lot of occasions when we have to work together, and could use other examples. I'm just using because Neil and I are sitting across the table from each other. I could use DHS as the example. So when you talk about aligning, what we're really talking about doing is aligning the area where we overlap.
That's absolutely.
When our systems are designed for our core missions.
The business process management theorist would tell you what aligns you is an output on one side and a customer on the other side. You can define every process in terms of some output that some customer needs. We'll get into a level of complexity we probably don't want here.
But I think that that's even a better example, is that what happens is you've got these two completely different departments, agencies, for different purposes for a reason.
Yeah.
That shouldn't change.
One's a customer,
but they're
the
coming
other.
together for a reason. Is that reason that they're coming together, who even in one government, but different agencies, they use completely different language and think of the same word in a different way. But if you don't get alignment on when you're working together, this is the alignment. It goes to John's point, it's clarity with alignment. Because sometimes clarity is if you don't have alignment on there. And then what's happening is you're all using different words and different definitions, and you can see it exactly when the project starts going away is when people are starting to interpret what they think they need, and they're interpreting it from their own world.
So can I pick up a point? I think, Elaine, you asked an interesting question that I think might highlight what everyone's saying here. If you acquire a company and then do you basically pull their budget out? I would frame the question a little differently. First off, I think we all know if you acquire a company and you take their budget away from them, you probably shouldn't have bought them to begin with, because if you don't trust them to do something in terms of building products or marketing products or selling products, or whatever it is you bought them to do, then they lose their autonomy and they usually lose their motivation to live, and you end up having bought something that evaporates. Maybe you bought IP and you're okay. But almost invariably, when you acquire a company, this is what's going to get onto the point about various government agencies. When you acquire a company, you often defer a decision on an ERP implementation. You say to yourself, we're going to let them continue to have their order entry system because it's built into their culture. We're going to let them have different accounting standards. Sometimes I've seen people even with different fiscal years. And it just hangs out there and causes frustration and irritation and ineffectiveness, and frankly, false expectations about the way they're supposed to work in your organization, because you can't do the processes that Jeff and Jim have been talking about if you've got somebody that operates so independently. And a lot of times in an M&A deal, you end up sort of half promising an executive team a certain amount of autonomy, and you find yourself hung by it later, and you finally say, oops, I just blew it. So anyway, this is what would bring me back to your situation when you acquire another department and the reporting lines change, or arguably when different government agencies have to share a database. My argument here would be you do need these processes to work across. You do need single database, preferably Sybase based on this table. But you do need to define those processes, understand the customer. And I don't know that if you can get the U.S. Census to work with a no-fly list, I would hate my name to show up in the wrong spot. But ultimately, a database of people and permissions seems like one thing to me. It seems like one thing with a series of processes with a number of different users. And it's going to take a knuckle dragger of a CIO to drive that kind of a thing through, people with different agendas. I don't know how you'll ever pull it off. It doesn't
John,
seem
one
like
thing
it's
to
easy.
think about,
as you can imagine, we're a very discreet client of DHS. So, you know, on all of your behalf, we're the customer. And I think the thing that I would say to you is, if you start with what everybody has said in defining the mission, and then examining the process that will support the mission and lead to success, you'll find that a lot of the periphery stuff is really just that. I mean, it's really not core to the mission of DHS. And if you just focus on that, and you know we are I'm sitting down here in my BlackBerry talking to your boss, so we're constantly trying to make certain that we mutually understand one another's approach to the mission. You almost perfectly comport to just about everything everybody's saying.
Elaine, I seen, so we're talking two-level things here, to answer your question. When we acquire a company, I suspect everybody here too, is they let them to have their own, let's call it customer relationship management, customer-facing data. That's an application they let alone. Order entry will be an application. But I have very seldom see acquiring a company and leave the IT budget separate. I almost have never seen a two IT department. You know, there may be two sales team because they have, and then eventually every one of us find ways to merge the customer data so that both sales team gets advantage of each other's. And therefore, they're sharing the data between states or Treasury or DHS and whatever. That makes a lot of sense. So now the problem is scoped to, how do I make two sets of applications talk to each other to get some more intelligence out of it? But I have never seen, I mean, maybe there's here, but I have never seen that we bought a company and then I leave you your IT budget. The reason why we have to centralize the IT budget is because then this is the only hope that in the future the infrastructure will come together for saving money and make it more efficient and more manageable for governance reasons, for a whole bunch, risk management, a whole bunch of reasons. Can't let everybody go off and do their IT stuff.
John Gage, we've been talking about technology that affects processes, and obviously a lot of the processes, all the processes affect people, and you've been an observer and participant in this process from the perspective of federal employees. It'd be interesting to hear your response to some of the things that have been on the table.
Yeah, I'm abandoning all hope, but it's, you know, when I think about all the different parts of the government, and for instance, trying to simplify it, even the claims processes, for instance, if you take CIS, Social Security, Veterans, IRS, it's tough. Even when we tried the no-match list, when they wanted the Social Security records on for immigration purposes, there was a big pushback within Social Security on that, as well as people all around the country. But the thing about our people that I think is so good is, for instance, Social Security, which is the only one that still has its own IT. I mean, they have 2,500 programmers up there. It's a band-aided system. Right check, right time, but I don't think anybody could only the people who know it could really change it. But the thing about it that makes it so exasperating are the changes that Congress makes. You could have the best strategic plan in the world. Pow! You have a new program, a change that is, you know, everybody hit the mattresses and trying to get it accomplished. So it's amazing that the government, I think, has operated as well as it has. And I think it really comes down to the employees who just take these things and say, oh, God, look what we got to do now.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Are there really 2,500 IT people
In Social Security?
on Social Security?
Yeah, our systems operation is pretty big.
Sir, I was the CIO of the IRS. I had 7,000 employees and 4,000 contractors.
I wouldn't want to prescribe anything. I'll make an observation.
Well,
there is an executive around the table that, you know, I track nigh on 100 million consumers and their behaviors, as they match up play games, have permissions, et cetera. Very different thing.
Right.
Trust me, if the football doesn't appear, they get really angry. Okay? Not the same as not getting your check. But if I've got 35 people doing that, it would surprise me. And an observation is, I'm guessing that legacy systems bolted together, band-aided, challenging processes, a lack of understanding of who should have access, who can write to the system versus who can just pull data from the system. Bunches of, I don't know what all the issues are, but that's expensive.
But you just said the legacy systems issue, and moving in new systems to legacy is probably the biggest challenge that the IRS faces. And I would argue that many of them.
Well, look, Congress legislates changes to tax code.
All the time.
It is mind-numbing. You know, increasingly, we do policy in the government through the tax code, and every one of them involves a whole lot of changes to the code and therefore to the system. And it is.
I have about 1,000 programmers who did nothing but deal with tax code issues from Congress.
And that's because of the number of changes, or because of the number of people?
It
program. It would
Right.
vary, but 300 to 600 significant changes a year in legislation.
I don't think that should be viewed as orders of magnitude different from what you'd see in businesses that have similar dynamics. If you take a look at the parts of our industry, the old telcos that provide you with plain old telephone service when you pick up your phone, they have tens of thousands of programmers in their IT department, tens of thousands of them, dealing with systems that were developed 20, 30 years ago that are huge, do enormous transaction volumes, and you can't pause and say, fine, I'll tear it down and go build something. There's lots of examples of people in our industry who've headed down a modernization path and then just backed away because the risk was so high of breaking something that couldn't break. So I don't find that unusual, which is why I get back to call it what you want. I think alignment's a fine deal. Why spend your time automating something before you know what it is you're automating? You know that the data you have, regardless of where it is, has integrity. And you've taken a look at the process and attempted to at least document it clearly, and then maybe simplify it a little bit, but at least have documentation integrity on data and process.
And I think that being well put, I think that taking that uncertainty and magnitude of change, that change environment in which you have to succeed, obviously has to be part of the definition of the mission, and that risk has to be accommodated in the clarity of the plan that you put together. It's a clear component of, I think, something that's unlikely to change, to hear you tell it.
If it does, you got the wrong mission. Right? Your strategy defines your mission defines your processes, and those should have some durability. Those shouldn't change every 18 months.
So I think you do have an extra challenge in that you do have probably a ton of legacy systems that you have to deal with. But I think the way we look at it at some point is we say we're not going to invest any more in adding functionality to the legacy system. We're just going to start figuring out how to extract the data from it and move on. And so it's not a simple task, but at some point we just say you're investing.
Populate a new system with the data from the old system and then build the new system.
That's right.
Yeah, as soon as you try to tackle that major issue of like the IRS or cutting a check, I think what happens is you just went right down the rat hole fast.
Well, I mean,
so to
in
come
fact,
in and say, I'm going to solve another problem and over time just keep picking and pulling away is at least a realistic approach that you can then use contemporary kinds of technologies. You can get the alignment a lot faster. If you want to get alignment on rewriting a major core system, I think you're done. So I think it's the strategy has to read, I'm going to let all of that inefficiency, which is really annoying everybody, I'm going to let that sit there because I can't tackle that right now. But I can tackle these other things, and eventually I'm going to change the culture enough and change where I can get at some of those things, and the problem won't be as big. But solving the big fish in something as large as the government, I think it's disaster.
You're right.
Well, that's how you build those giant IT projects that hit a certain point and you say, oh my God, I got to abandon it after I've spent $780 million,
In fact, that was the experience in
$2.8 billion, or
tax system
on
modernization.
FAA or tax or whatever it is, yeah.
Can I say, this has been extremely useful. What I would love to do is see how we can distill some of these ideas into concrete, actionable recommendations for the government. Maybe we can do a quick lightning round, and I'd love to get your thoughts in terms of what could we do in the federal government? Maybe one or two recommendations that you think would be central as we think about managing these large IT projects, $76+ billion budget, and modernizing some of the outdated processes that you're responding to. John, can we start with you?
Yeah, I know the subject is IT, but I would, in the business world vernacular, I would really establish it as your business strategy. And then the IT is an enabler. But you get, to everything that's been said, business strategy, take that into a clarity of what your objectives are, have some clear owners, and then execute.
I would pick a few beacon projects. I'd pick 3 or 4 projects that are really important, that are some of which involve things like interdepartmental collaboration, some of which involve maybe one organization to do it. And I would put extraordinary amount of management attention to make sure they succeed, so that one of the things you can do is avoid the cynical belief that nothing's going to change because nothing ever changes. And you can propagate best practices into the organizations much more effectively by having 2 or 3 exemplars of it working that will then propagate and ripple through. Because with $76 billion, you're obviously not going to change it all at once. So I pick maybe it's 3 or 4, maybe it's half a dozen, but a relatively constrained number of cases where you know you're going to make a huge difference, and it'll make a difference substantively and symbolically.
I think we touched on it a bit, but we didn't spend a lot of time today talking about, we talked about process, we talked about purpose. We didn't talk a lot about ownership, of who owns these projects and how they work along what I would call the gating process. And then at the end of the day, do you have the same people that are responsible all the way? Because I have a sense that some of these are longer term and you have a lot of turnover, and so nobody really owns the project. I don't know that for sure, but I have a sense that that's a risk here because of the complexity and some turnover in
regular change in leadership.
And the other thing I heard early on in the discussion was a lot of focus on simplicity, off-the-shelf software, keeping the processes simple. And yet, as you talk about it, you're talking about complexity that is created perhaps through Congress, through the regulatory environment, that the project team has no control over. And there's no way for them to push back. So that's a question, that's not a solution.
I think that's a description of the general environment and one of the reasons we're having this conversation.
Yeah.
James?
I'd do exactly what Rob mentioned. I'd make sure I picked a small number of projects that had a high chance of success, and then I'd add that I would make sure either internally or externally I had some people who were really smart on the state-of-the-art business process management. That's a whole discipline, separate and distinct from IT. And at least in my view, is key to success in IT.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar. I think the way the words we would use in our company are things like have an outside-in view. What do they really need? Why do they need it? Create a small set of high-impact systems that go at starting to bite away at these big beasts. Don't go after the big beasts. Start from the outside and come in with a small defined set of projects.
I'll go back. I was struck by the president, his comments, they were really smaller projects where he was talking about some of the challenges.
The Department of Defense and the VA system, that makes a lot of sense.
I'd resist the urge to believe that. I'd resist the urge to believe that every IT project is so different that you have to do it yourself. There is software that we all leverage around the table, even though we run different businesses, that have helped us run our business. So there is software that you can leverage across different departments, which goes to the don't make it overly complex, the 18 months. I'd also highlight successes. There are a lot of successes that you've had, and the more it's less of the stick and more of the carrot about what the benefits are of IT, I think that could be aspirationally why people say, yeah, we'd love to be part of this agenda of transforming, which I applaud you for taking on.
No, I'll do the life cycle, and I mean everything is makes sense, and I do the life cycle and the culture part. The life cycle part is really control the specs. The spec time can be that long. It has to be very identifiable. It has to be aligned. Even if it's a much smaller project, you might want to take $780 million project, break it into 3 pieces, and then say nothing's longer than 18 months, and do what you can with that. And if you can't do it, we can it. I mean, that's basically that. I mean, I would do that. And then after that, then you take that and celebrate those successes, and you get the employee, the federal employees get excited about it, and then everybody's kind of looking at an 18-month success. And that's not a bad thing, actually.
I assume you mean 18-month projects which lead to outcomes where if you stop there, you have something useful.
Yes.
Yeah.
But if you
Yes.
keep going, you get to go after the beasts.
Yes.
Yeah,
Right.
you stop it, and then you define the next 18, the different project.
Yeah.
And that's the same as chipping at the problems and not trying to bite the core. It's the same as that, and everybody would like the little success they can celebrate.
Biting at the core, though,
It's tempting.
is seductive.
It's
Yes.
tempting, but you never deliver anything because you're biting at the core.
Right.
Yeah, you're right. I guess 2 things. For federal employees, it's really embarrassing when our agencies get fleeced. And this has really happened to Social Security, IRS, FBI. And there has to be some either oversight or centralized group that is going to make big purchases, I think. But the other thing, and the president, when you brought up the president, he was talking about General Shinseki. The moment he walked in, I'm going to make the VA paperless. Have I heard that before? And they have made, for instance, he's talking about the veterans benefits, which is delays, back, all that. And Social Security did the same thing, and much of it is automated. There's the straight retirement claim coming out of Iowa. No problem. The disability case coming out of Puerto Rico, independence, little different. So a lot of this paper that's floating around are exceptions that I don't know if you ever can get to it with the congressional changes and with the complexity of the existing laws. So I'm hoping to tamp down General Shinseki a little bit about trying to make the whole, I think he's really running into a wall and trying to bite off the core thing where exceptions are, they're just going to be exceptions that have to be done in another way.
So I actually really support what has been said so far in terms of a couple of beta projects, really simple, clear process definition. So I have one tactical suggestion for how to make that come together with your 2 or 3 important beta projects you want to push through. Get all of your stakeholders together, have them put up all their system requirements, have them rank them A, B, C, D, E, F. Draw the line under A, tell your successor he can deal with B through F. Keep it just there. You're going to seduce them into listing. They will tell you what's more important. But, you got 3 years left, we hope, maybe 7 years left. Draw a line and get an accomplishment completed that works, and then go back for the B priorities. That can be another project in and of itself that adds functionality to it, where the process definition can take place, but A's only.
I want to just use an analogy about building cathedrals and laying the brick. I think it's, for whatever the project is, it's important that everybody on the team knows you're building a cathedral, you're not building a bridge. So kind of have the end in mind. It doesn't mean this cathedral is exactly end up to be how you designed it, but it's a cathedral. And then the people who are working on it need to know how to lay the brick, because laying brick is a simpler task than thinking about cathedral. Sometimes you have a vision, but everybody panic because they don't know how to build a cathedral. And so the people's task is, I'm just using the analogy of laying the brick. They need to have a line of sight that what they do every day is going to be part of this vision. And then so when you're building the cathedral, there'll be failure, something doesn't come together, right? And don't just take it and throw it away as a termination. Look at it, why did it not come together? And take that as an opportunity, as a correction, so everybody learns how to build the bricks, or lay the bricks that do come together. But because everybody knows we're building a cathedral, it will come out as a cathedral.
I'd agree with obviously what everybody said, and I suppose going back to where we opened the discussion, I'd suggest that you take full advantage of your executive sponsorship while you've got it. Because it's pretty powerful executive sponsorship, as we heard it. So.
Well, thank you all very much. This was an interesting and important conversation. We're quite determined, I think I speak for Vivek and Jeff and the whole team, that we don't mean for this to be a conversation that happens in a couple of hours this afternoon, but that it becomes a process where we actually can make change. And what we're going to do next is come back together and report from each of these discussions. And I know Jeff has plans to follow up with each of you individually so that we can tap into your knowledge, your desire and willingness to help beyond today and to get some things really accomplished. But let me just thank you, each of you, for taking time for your very busy schedules to share your experience with us, your knowledge. I hope we've been able to give you a sense of the complexity of our environment, which is different from your own, but we know you each have complex environments, so your experience is highly relevant to helping us think this through. I think what we're going to do now is invite the group to go back to the room where the President spoke earlier, and we're going to stand to stay behind for just a few minutes so we can pull some notes together so we can report out from this group in the next session. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. One more thing, I also want to recognize the fact that we have in the room here CIOs from the State Department, from GSA, from Treasury, Commerce, EPA, and Homeland Security. And part of what we want to be able to do, as the President said, is learn and leverage the best ideas, recognizing that the best thinking is not necessarily within the four walls of Washington. And this is just the beginning. And as Jack said, there will be follow-up steps that Jeff will talk about at the main session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.